Welcome to Proposals Made Easy, a step-by-step guide for grant seekers. So the first thing I'd like to do is start out with a question for all of you. I'm sure that everyone out there who's listening today has at least one project or program that has been supported by a grant funder. And I just wanted to ask a few of you to type in what project is being grant funded at your club right now. So just maximize that question box and answer the question, what projects are being grant funded at your club right now? We'll read these out for everyone to kind of hear. Maybe you'll get some new ideas. Christina says the Triple Play program. Becky Fleischman says Healthy Lifestyles. Tara says almost all of them. Good job getting that grant support. OJP and Diplomas to Degrees. After School Learning, Summer and Technology programs. Peggy says their Healthy Habits program. Angel says Power Hour and Money Matters. Amanda says STEM programs. Faculty and Building Repair. Mentoring programs, a grant for technology, a technical training center, and Emily reminds us, don't forget, 21st Century CLC, the Community Learning Center grant. Excellent. My hope is that in hearing some of the different ways that attendees are being grant funded, you can start to think of programs that you might be able to seek grant support for as well. A couple of others that have come up, Diplomas to Degrees, Passport to Manhood and Smart Girls, Capital Improvement, OJP grants, Graduate por Más, Tech grants, Project Learn, Money Matters, Smart Moves, and Facility Renovations. One thing that you might notice is that those do fall into being signature programs, into being right on mission, into being things that do fall in line with what we are supposed to be doing at Boys and Girls Clubs and trying to have the maximum impact for youth. And that's really a best practice, and it's something to kind of reflect on as we continue to talk about grants and foundations. So to start, a little foundation focus. Here are some basic facts about foundations in the United States. There are 86,192 foundations in the U.S. In 2014, giving from foundations comprised 15% of total private giving. If you've been on webinars with me before, you know that I like to harp away on trying to have your support mirror the support that's being given out there in the community. So in other words, if 15% of total giving comes from foundations, you should try to have your portfolio somewhere near to that figure. If 15% of total private giving comes from foundations and 85% of your giving comes from foundations, you're somewhat at risk because you're overly reliant on foundations. If you only have 2 or 3% coming from foundations, you have a great opportunity to increase in this area. Foundations last year comprised $52 billion in giving, 1.5 million not-for-profit organizations were supported by foundations. There are 4 basic types, and we're going to talk about each of them. Independent foundations, community foundations, corporate foundations, and operating foundations. So what are each of these? First, independent foundations. These are private entities established to distribute grants to tax-exempt organizations. Grant contributions are funded one of 2 ways. Endowment, so income from the endowment established at this organization is used to make grants, or periodic contributions, where living donors make contributions to the fund and basically use the foundation as a pass-through for their own giving. So they put the money into the fund and ask that foundation disperse that money out. Those endowment-based organizations are a good example of why a heavy reliance on foundations can put your funding streams at risk. When we had the Great Recession strike, those organizations who were heavily founded by foundations felt a real crunch because the foundation's endowments started performing much less, and those endowments are where the dollars that they give out charitably come from. So there was less money for them to give away. So understanding kind of how foundations work helps you to understand how to budget and how to approach foundations. Next, worth mentioning are family foundations. So these are the fastest growing sector in independent giving, but they're not actually their own separate category. Here's how they work and what sets them apart. First, a living donor or more than 2 trustees share the surname of the foundation. They self-identify as a family foundation. the family makes the priority or grant allocation decision. So this really is a way that a family makes its own charitable giving. So philanthropists make this foundation, they allocate the gifts. Family foundations represent over 50% of independent foundations. And oftentimes for us at the club level, they should be treated like an individual donor. So you would solicit and steward them the same way that you would for any other major gift donor. You would still have a strong cultivation process and a personalized and appropriate stewardship plan. Because here you're really interacting with people. The difference is that the gifts to you aren't coming out of their individual checkbook, they're coming out of a family foundation checkbook. For recognition purposes, the Boys and Girls Clubs of America considers gifts from family foundations eligible for recognition in our giving societies, because really this is just a vehicle through which individuals make their gifts. Lastly, when you're recognizing someone who is given to you through a family foundation, it's a good idea to ask how they want to be recognized. They may not wish to be recognized as the Smith Family Foundation, but rather as Steve and Lucy Smith. So it's a best practice to just ask. Next are community foundations. Lots of our clubs get great support through community foundations. These are locally or regionally focused and accumulate their assets through a number of different donors. Here's how they're different. First, they have a general fund along with separate funds for individual donors. So within the community foundation, there may be that community foundations fund, but also individuals sort of use it the same way as a family foundation would, where they give their dollars to the community foundation to meet tax requirements, and then they're able to make gifts from there. There's a clearly set of guidelines directed by a governing board. Grants are made from general funds as well as donor-designated or donor-advised funds. These are great prospects for supporting our club because nobody's making more of an impact than we at the Boys and Girls Clubs on their communities. So if the mission is to support the communities, we've got it in spades. These are very different from other foundations because they provide an immediate tax deduction to the donor. So the donor makes their gift and they are able to accrue a tax deduction, even if they need to take a little while longer to decide how to make that gift. It sits in that charitable checkbook. They offer a wide range of giving options. They provide staff support to the donor, and they're easy to arrange. So lots of donors use the community foundation because it's a very easy way, much less intensive than setting up a family foundation. Some Boys and Girls Clubs also use them to manage their own restricted or endowed funds, particularly smaller clubs with smaller endowments. These can be a great fit for you because they're less competitive than national foundations. You can receive support through both the general community fund and through donor-designated funds. So definitely make friends with your community foundation. If you don't know anyone at the community foundation, see if you can make an appointment, get in to see them, tell them about what you do, and try to get a representative from that community foundation to come and tour your club. The next kind of foundations are operating foundations. Operating foundations spend at least 85% of their income supporting their own programs. They're a lot like other not-for-profits. So they raise funds, they have a governing board, they employ staff to carry out projects and programs. They have great partnership opportunities for clubs if a shared mission exists. And one way that I've seen clubs do this really effectively is through public schools foundations. So if it's the Boston Public Schools Foundation and you're the Boston Boys and Girls Club, you have some shared priorities and you can probably come up with some great partnership opportunities with that operating foundation. Lastly are corporate foundations. Although these are legally separate entities from the corporation itself, they're established by businesses ranging from major corporations to family-owned small businesses. The distribution is largely dependent on the company's profits. So again, those clubs who were heavily reliant upon corporate foundations when we had the Great Recession saw their income plummet as well. Typically, they fund projects and initiatives where the company has facilities and employees. And so you might see this if you're applying online for, say, the Wells Fargo Foundation, but there aren't any Wells Fargo banks in your community, it's unlikely that they'll fund you. They provide matching funds for employee charitable contributions. Sometimes you've all gotten emails or letters saying, so-and-so has made a gift, it's eligible for matching. That's a great way to get gifts doubled. And promoting those employee charitable match programs among employees in your community can be a good way for you to accrue some extra donations. Oftentimes, corporate foundations provide funds for organizations and projects in which their employees are involved. And on first glance, it might seem like, oh, it's another hoop we have to jump through to be able to get those gifts. But the flip side of that is that corporation is willing to support you twice by both giving you their employees' time and by giving you their dollars. A great example of a fantastic corporate foundation partner who does this is Kohl's. So they'll send their folks over to help volunteer, and then after that volunteering, they'll also make a charitable gift. Corporate contributions can sometimes go beyond cash and include in-kind services, volunteers, sharing resources. So for example, Disney has hosted club leaders in their Leadership Institute, those matching gifts, and product donations. When I was at the local club, we had a board member who was from Coca-Cola, and their foundation donated all kinds of stuff to us, oftentimes things that they had used for community activities or promotion events and didn't need anymore. So those corporate foundations can be great partners. So let's talk about the why of foundation giving. What's the motivation of your foundation prospect? And this is something that you can hopefully find out through research, through talking to other people who have been funded by these people, by doing your reading, or even by talking to program officers at the organization. Do they want to increase the capacity of nonprofits to serve constituents? Maybe they have a legacy interest in a specific cause or organization. They may have a commitment to improving a particular region, or they may aspire to have national or international impact on a particular issue. So for example, your donor is very interested in high school graduation rates in the Midwest region. If you are able to show how you impact high school graduation rates in the Midwest region, you're able to fit into the motivation of your foundation prospect. So here's a question. Which comes first, the funder or the project? When I was at the club, I was guilty of doing this all the time. I would find a donor who supported something and immediately start trying to figure out how I could shoehorn something into that area or create a whole new program so that I would be able to attract those donors. The fact is, if you let the funder determine your priorities, your plan is always in jeopardy. You're not necessarily staying on your mission. You start to do what's called mission creep, where your mission gets bigger and bigger, and suddenly you're running a humane society out of the basement of your club. Suddenly you're involved in service that has nothing to do with promoting the future for kids. If you develop your plan and seek funding to support your plan, you aren't deviating from succeeding in your identified priorities. So you want to look for a perfect match. That means that if financial literacy is an important part of your mission and you're doing things like, I can't remember the name of the financial literacy program that we do, that someone just said they were doing. What was it? Money Matters. If you're doing Money Matters, that's a great match for a bank's corporate foundation, for example. But if your club isn't doing anything that has to do with financial literacy, you may very well be misleading the donor as well as your club kids in trying to lead them down this path, searching for money. Because once you get that funding, you have to deliver on those project deliverables, and sometimes you, the funding person, are not in a position to direct programming. And when you go into your games room manager and say, boy, do I have a great idea for you, neither of you may be empowered to change programming or to carry out and deliver on those things that you're promising to your donors. But a project starts with a good idea. Moving from a good idea to a well-defined project, you'll need, first, a concept that fits within your club's mission and strategic or organizational plan. So you don't want to be doing these one-offs chasing money. You want to focus on your key outcomes and your key programs for your club. Next, a project that's fully developed with staff identified who are capable to lead and a reasonable time frame. So if you have a project that's fully developed, you should have already spoken with those staff. You should know that they're able to deliver on the things that you're promising. You should know the time frame, etc. Your good idea should have a well-defined budget and the capacity to deliver and manage the program. It can be really hard to sort of have the feeling that you're turning down money when you don't apply for something that you aren't capable of running, but sometimes it's a good idea. When I was at the club, I had this great idea. I thought, we're going to have a branch bank right in one of our clubs, and this bank foundation is going to fund it. It's going to be amazing. The problem was we didn't have nearly enough staff or the space or some of the financial resources in place to be able to have a bank branch right in our club, regardless of whether a bank was going to give us the funding. It would have taken a significant amount of staff time and expertise to do. So even though it was a good idea, it didn't really fit into our strategic plan. We didn't have a fully developed project, and we definitely didn't have the staff to be able to do it. So going from a good idea to a concept. Do you have the people you need to execute? Is it a mission fit? Can you document that there is a need for this project? And can you propose through your project a solution to that need? Does the project align with the funder's goals and objectives? This is really important. If your project doesn't align to the funder's goals and objectives, you're wasting your time doing that application. Once you see that good fit, once you've made that love connection, that's the application you want to send out. Is the need that you're trying to address really an issue? How do you know? Is it compelling? How can you show that there's a need for the program that you are proposing? So let's say that you're proposing a meals program. Can you show that 50% of your community is on free and reduced lunch? Can you show that kids in your community are going hungry? Can you show that at your club you have more kids who are hungry? And then can you propose a solution, your meals program, that will address that need? I see Topher said he's lost audio. I apologize for that, Topher. I hope that everybody else is still able to hear right now. I haven't done anything differently, so let me know if you get your audio back. If anyone else is missing audio and you could just type something there in the questions, I would appreciate it. Nope. Okay, we're going to keep going. Going from good idea to concept, and now we're going to go from concept to project. Research to identify the problem and how the problem will solve it with a plan that clearly defines the goals and objectives. This is what makes, what distinguishes a foundation donor. They're really looking for a clearly developed plan, clear evidence of need, clear goals and objectives, clear evidence that you're going to be able to address those problems that you identify. So first, you're going to want to develop your plan. What partners can you engage in executing this plan? This could be the 4-H. It could be your local school district. It might be other youth-serving organizations like the Boy Scouts or Girl Scouts. It could be law enforcement. It could be your local public library. Staff. Will you need to bring in additional staff? What percentage of your current staff's time will need to be devoted to doing this project? Next, activities. Your success really depends on clearly defining tasks, ongoing evaluation, and specific measurement. So let's say, for example, that I am proposing that a summer football program is going to lead to significantly more healthy behaviors on the part of my kids. I'm going to need some way to show that that has happened, and I'm going to need ongoing measurement. So it might be that before we start, I see how many push-ups and sit-ups the kids can do, how much they weigh. I measure some of their attitudes about health and exercise, and I continue to administer those measures throughout the summer football program. My claim would then be, by the end of the summer, the youth engaged in this football program will weigh less, have better activities about exercise, will have better cardiovascular evidence, can do more push-ups and sit-ups and things like that. So I have a way to measure what I'm saying that I will do. And this is really, really important to those grant funders. Your National Youth Outcomes Initiative data is going to be one great way that you can measure outcomes. Next, schedules. Is your timetable reasonable and achievable? So I'm not going to be able to increase the graduation rate at my club by 75% in 6 months, but I can make some incremental increase. You also need to have a general idea of what it will cost as you're thinking about how to execute this. Next, find the funders. So you started with your project. Now you're going to go on to look at who your prospects are and then take a deep dive on that foundation. Some of the places where you can find that information are Foundation Center, Chronicle of Philanthropy, GuideStar, and I have some of those listed on a future slide that you can see some good places to identify prospective funders. A good prospect has both the capacity to give and the inclination to give. So if, for example, you know that there is a fantastic family foundation in your community and you've got your proposal and you're ready to write it up and deliver it to that family foundation, that's great. But if all they support are environmental causes, that's not a great fit for our mission, and so it's not a good use for your time. Determine your first approach strategy. So how are you going to first be able to get in to see that foundation? You might send them a concept paper. It might be making a phone call to talk to their program officers. It could be that you approach them through email, or you try to arrange a personal visit. Now, foundations are professionally staffed with program officers, who is the grant contact person. You definitely want to try to get to know this person. You can contact them and ask to learn more about their foundation, try to meet with them, and basically try to find out how to become a funding partner. This is really difficult to achieve, and more so the more organizations are vying for resources. So it may be that you could have better results through phone or email, but just like with the donor, you want to start by trying to get that face-to-face meeting if you possibly can. As you're doing research on your foundation, you're going to find out some things that will be important for you as you're doing your application. The foundation information is going to let you know the geographic limitations. So if they only support certain counties and you're not in that county, don't waste your time. Specific areas of interest, we've covered this. You may also be able to find a listing of funded organizations. And if you see other Boys and Girls Clubs, feel free to reach out and contact that club. It's not going to put their funding in jeopardy for you to apply, but they may be able to tell you some important things that you wouldn't know about that donor. Or it could be that they've supported similar organizations, say Girls Inc. or the Y, and that's a good tip-off to you that they might support the Boys and Girls Club as well. While you're doing your research, you're also going to find out the application procedures and guidelines. These are either sent to you or they're published, and they may say to you what you should do first. Make a phone call first, write a letter of inquiry, no unsolicited applications are accepted, accepts unsolicited applications. You want to follow these guidelines exactly. If you're looking at a private or family foundation, these folks should be approached as individuals. Establishing the rapport is as important and is the same as it would be if you were approaching an actual individual. A good pipeline is probably 3 to 1. So you probably will get 1 grant funded for every 3 that you apply for. So when you're doing your budget projections, that's a good rule of thumb. Be sure that you're very carefully keeping track of deadlines for applications, dates for reviews, that you know when reports are due, and that you know the grant's funding schedules. This can keep you from getting in hot water with one of your organizations by failing to meet a deadline or by failing to apply on time and losing funding that you thought you had. I think a lot of people on the webinar have probably been in that situation, and it's just really is terrible. There's a resource that you're going to be able to download after the webinar, which was brought to us by our friends at the Boys and Girls Clubs of St. Louis, and it's their task tracking spreadsheet that they use for their foundation donors. It is a great tool, and I would encourage you to use it so that you don't miss any of those important deadlines. Now that you've done all this research, you are ready to begin. So, be sure you do your homework. Do you need to get approved as a fit? Do they ask you to start with a letter of inquiry or a letter of intent? Do they want an executive summary? Do you have to apply online? You'll need to know these things before you start. What's the timeline? Does your schedule fit with their schedule? Include your timeline and make sure that they fit. And before you begin, see if you can find a connection. See if you can find a way to make that relationship. So these are the components of a proposal. The proposal is really what you'll send out as a solicitation to your foundation. Getting help on putting together grant proposals, if you're a small club, this could be a great job for a board member to assist you with because this kind of elevated style of writing, this very detailed style of writing, is something that board members are familiar and comfortable with. So first will be your executive summary. Your executive summary is a statement of your case and a summary of the entire proposal. It actually can be a good practice to wait until the end of your whole application to write that executive summary, because what you can then do is make sure that your executive summary touches on everything that you needed to outline during your proposal. The next thing after your executive summary will be a statement of need. This is where you make the case. So if I am applying for Passport to Manhood, I might talk about some of the issues facing young men in my community. I might talk about how citizenship is vitally important to kids in my community. I'm going to make a compelling case for why something needs to be done to address these problems. Next, your project description. This is the real nuts and bolts of how the project will be implemented and when the project will be implemented. You can't gloss over this and hope that your funder is going to understand. And this can be hard because we know those nuts and bolts so well, but you really want to be sure to take a step back and imagine if this would be clear to someone who's hearing about it for the very first time. Next is your budget narrative. Be sure and run your budget narrative by someone in your accounting office or whoever does your books to make sure it's realistic, to make sure that it's accurate. You'll also need to describe your organization. We could all do this in our sleep, right? And then lastly, in your conclusion, you're going to summarize everything that you've said and make a case for why you are a great fit for this funder's needs. All of your funders are philanthropists. They're hoping to accomplish something through their giving. And so here you're trying to show why you're the best agent to accomplish it. So your executive summary, let's start there. This may be the only section that's carefully read, at least by some people at the foundation. If it's not good enough, they may not go any further. So make sure that first sentence is just outstanding. Then provide a very compelling statement of the problem or need you want to address. This shouldn't be hard because there's nothing more compelling than the problems of the young people that we serve. You can include some of those statistics that you're gathering through NYOI, or you can do some research to find statistics relevant to kids in your community. Next, you'll describe the project, the outcome, and how success will be measured. So how will the community be different as a result of this project, and how specifically will you know that you've been successful? Describe why this project fits with the funder's priorities. State here the amount that you need and how you plan to fund the program in the future. Because a savvy funder is going to think, well, this literacy program sounds amazing and I'd love to give them $75,000. But once they've spent my $75,000, how do I know that the program won't just go away? And so this is something that you really want to address. Funders want to support something that'll be sustainable. Otherwise, the impact of their dollars is really limited. If applicable, you can identify your other funding partners. You can also say those organizations to whom you are applying. I will tell you that funders do check, so don't say you're applying somewhere that you won't. Don't say you've secured dollars that you haven't secured. Usually your foundation funders don't want to be the first dollars through the door, so they want to see that there are some other dollars to support what they're doing. You also want to explain why you are uniquely qualified to solve this problem. So if I'm talking about a problem of decreasing graduation rates, I want to talk about how the program after school plus the program in school is going to yield higher graduation rates and why we get to see the kids for so much time after school. Here's the data on after school. Here's why we can do it. Next is the statement of need. So here decide which facts and statistics best support your project. Here you want to decide if you want to put your project forward as a model for others to replicate. That can be very persuasive to a funder. You may even have in mind that this is going to be shared with other clubs throughout your state alliance and how other clubs are going to implement it. Determine whether it's reasonable for you to portray the need as a crisis. So your club needing to feed kids after school, that may very well be a crisis. Your club needing to expand its games room, that is probably not a crisis. Determine whether you can demonstrate that your program addresses the need differently or better than other projects or organizations. So one of the things that makes us really unique is that we have the physical space in which our programs occur. Another thing that makes us unique is our low staff to student ratio. Third are the number of hours that we're available to kids. So you may want to demonstrate that we address the need better than other organizations, and those are some of the reasons why. Can your solution sufficiently resolve the need? How will your organization and your donor be the hero when you're able to do it? Next comes your project description. And as you describe your project, every time you start talking about something, think, so what? And take it further to answer that so what question that your funders are going to be asking. Okay. Provide a clear link between the statement of need and your proposed project. So if I'm saying financial literacy is a crisis throughout limited income families in my community, then I'm going to show how providing financial literacy education to young people helps to address that need. Clearly define your goals and your objectives. Be sure that they're SMART, and we'll talk about that in a minute. Describe how you will meet your goals and objectives by defining your target population and your specific activities. So we want to increase financial literacy among young Latino families in this certain portion of the city. That's very specific as to who we're going to address, and it makes it easier to measure your success. Demonstrate a concrete plan for implementing each part of the project, including the staff that are required and the timeline. This shows that all of your planning is done before you apply, and that you have thought everything through, so that I, as the funder, don't have to wonder about whether you'll be successful. And now describe how you will evaluate your outcome objectives, the measurements that will be in place to spell out that you're successful. So when we say that your objectives need to be SMART, this is what it means. They need to be specific. How many kids will graduate as a result of your program? They need to be measurable. How can we measure graduation rates? That one shouldn't be too hard, right? They should be achievable. Can we achieve these during the time that we have allotted? They should be realistic. We can't affect the entire city's graduation rate, but we can affect the graduation rate of those kids at our club, for example. They should be time-bound. You need to have a specific time in which this is going to occur. How many months? How many weeks? When is the program happening? If you can show that your goals are SMART, specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, and time-bound, you're much more likely to get funded. So trying to explain the difference between goals and objectives and trying to articulate that was something that I always had a really hard time with. And I can remember sitting in front of this application for a local foundation and trying to articulate goals and objectives, inputs and outputs, outcomes and accomplishments and measurements, and just feeling like none of it was making any sense. So I wanted to spend a little time on that, and hopefully this will help you when you're trying to do this for your applications. So a goal is something, it's describing the general impact you hope to have on the problem you have defined. So if truancy is a major problem, you hope to decrease truancy rates among club kids by 50% by the end of 2016. Specific objectives. There are a couple of different types of objectives. First is awareness, trying to help people to become aware of an issue. Next is attitude, having people hold a certain attitude or belief. Behavior, a specific action will occur. Product, something is produced as a result. So, for example, a new building, a building renovation, new computers. So awareness, attitude, behavior, and product. For example, every young person who attends the club will achieve academic success and graduate on time with a plan for the future. That's the big, broad goal. Objective. Our after-school Power Hour program will assist 50 children in improving their reading scores by 1 grade level as demonstrated on standardized reading tests administered after participating in the program for 6 months. So you can see here I'm very specific about how many kids, how long the program is going to last, what the impact will be, and how we're going to measure it. So that is a SMART goal. In discussing staffing and administration, be specific. The funder wants to know that you can achieve results. So they need to know the number of staff, the staff's qualifications, their assignments, and the administration of the project. Sometimes you will also be asked to provide resumes of project staff, so that's something to be sure that you have access to. Next comes evaluation and measurement. Foundations have become very focused on demonstrating the effectiveness of their investments. This is something that still distinguishes foundation donors from individual donors, although individual donors are starting to move this way too. So be sure from the beginning that you can clearly state your process for evaluation. What will be measured, who will measure it, what method will you use, and how often will that measurement occur. If you're applying for something where these things can't be measured, you might want to rethink the program because it's unlikely that you'll get funded. So for example, the product is improved grades. We're going to say, did grades improve? The process, did Power Hour structure over 6 months accomplish anticipated results? How will we do that? By analyzing the grades of the students who participated. And I know one thing that I always had trouble with at the club level, and that a lot of you may have trouble with, is getting access to those grades as a way to evaluate. Hopefully your NYOI data will help to address some of that. Also, building a strong partnership with the school can be really helpful. And lastly, asking the parents or the kids for them directly is one way to get around that. Some clubs have report card parties where everybody sits down, brings in their report card, and they all get to have pizza if they brought in that report card. That's a great way to get those report cards, to get that important data. That is a limitation, though, that you should know. So you shouldn't promise report card data for every kid in your club if you don't have access from the school. The budget section. This is really important. The people who are giving you these dollars are not in the business of just signing off on a check. They want to be sure that you know what you're doing. So here you depict in your request the sum of all expenses, if it will include goods and services, personnel costs, and administrative overhead if allowed. So you can include in-kind and revenue support, multiple years if applicable. Here in your budget narrative, you justify the dollars that are needed and you explain any discrepancies, anything weird that can happen at that club level, which could be we're waiting on this proposal and if we get it, we'll do X, and if we don't, we'll do Y. It might be that you have a different fiscal year cycle than the person to whom you're applying. So all of those are things you discuss in that budget section. Next is organizational information. This part's great. This is where you get to articulate why you are uniquely qualified to implement the project. Don't go overboard, but do explain why you're uniquely qualified. The funder's guidelines may say what you need to discuss, but certainly you'll talk about your history and mission, demographics, staff, your board, your major accomplishments, and your capacity to carry out the proposed project. You may at this point also want to include testimony from credible sources that support your application. So if the local police captain wants to talk about why you do such a good job in limiting juvenile crime, or if someone from your school board wants to address your impact on academic preparedness, those would be great things to include in your organizational information. Lastly, you'll have a brief conclusion where you reiterate why what you're proposing is important and how you're a good fit for the funder's priorities, why this is necessary, why you're qualified, how much you are respectfully requesting and for how long, when you hope to start the project, and the contact with questions. Before you submit, have fresh eyes or multiple sets of fresh eyes review that final draft. I have never turned in a grant application without a sinking feeling in my stomach, worried to death that something was going to be wrong. There are really specific guidelines for how your funder wants their proposal. Some want 3 copies, some want a certain font, some want a certain, want them to be clipped in the upper right-hand corner. There are all kinds of things like that. Be sure that you meet all of those requirements. Use a font and point size that are nice and crisp. Most often used is 12-point Times New Roman. This is definitely not a place for Comic Sans. Left justified with 1-inch margins. Include headings and bullets throughout so that it's readable. Don't sacrifice readability for text. All the beautiful wording in the world isn't worth it if they don't read what you've written. Do number your pages, and include your organization and the funder's name in the footer. That way it's easy for them to tell whose application this is, because remember, they're getting hundreds of these. Be sure you include all the required attachments and signatures. Use clips, not staples, because usually they make copies. And once that thing is out the door, celebrate. One thing that I always did if it was a local foundation was I hand delivered it. Partly because I was so worried that it would get lost in the mail, and partly because if I could do anything to set myself apart from other people looking for funding, I wanted to do it. And every once in a while, I get to see the funder when I was dropping off that application, so that was always a bonus. I always said I was just in the neighborhood, which I was. I was just in the neighborhood to drop off that proposal. There are also attachments that you're going to need to include. These will include your proof of 501c3 status, your most recent audited financial statements, your overall budget, your 990, a list of your board of directors along with their business affiliations, and those resumes of key staff. Here you could also include letters of support from community leaders, law enforcement, anything like that. There are a couple of alternative proposal formats that some funders are going to. The first is the letter proposal. This is simply a 1 to 3 page letter that includes a condensed version of the proposal content. Don't make it too small to read. Really edit it well. Use subheadings to make it easier to find content, even in that 1 to 3 page letter, because you have less information to distinguish yourself, so you want to be sure it's really easily read. And then the online proposal. I think many on the webinar would agree that these can really be the bane of your existence. You only have to go through one of them and have a computer glitch where the dang thing disappears to know that you need to use the save button regularly. Be sure to read the instructions very carefully. These things are quirky and there's all kinds of different things each one is looking for. Here, the summary is critically important. It almost feels like the writing is less important in an online proposal because there's so much less that you get to say, but that word economy means that each word is actually worth more. So I recommend that you write everything out in a separate Word file and then paste it in, because it's a lot easier to have those little typos and those little mistakes to forget things you wanted to say in this weird online format. So again, read it carefully before you submit and get someone else to review. It seems less necessary on the online format, but it all prints out just like a paper one, so it is still really important. After submission, remember that program officers who are reviewing your application are also people. So try to communicate respectfully. Try to establish a relationship. If you don't know how to establish a relationship, you may be able to communicate to someone who's been funded by this person before, or you may be able to do a little sneaky research to figure it out. So you want to communicate, if at all possible, before the submission, during the review process, certainly after they decide to fund you, and if possible, after a decision to decline. Sometimes you can get really helpful feedback about why you weren't funded so that next year when you go in to apply, you will stand a better chance of getting funded. Here is a top 10 list of things that drive funders crazy. First, grant seekers who don't follow the guidelines. I once was a volunteer for a local Kiwanis organization, and one of the things that we got to do was review for these small, like $5,000 grants that we gave out to multiple organizations each year. And our guideline was that it had to help young children. Imagine my surprise when we would get applications for adult mental health, for senior citizens' homes, for animals. So people who are really just sort of a shotgun and whatever sticks they take. That drives folks crazy. Duplication of effort. They don't want to see 2 different organizations, 3 different organizations who are all doing the same thing when they could have collaborated to do it better and for less money. Blaming the competition. We could do so much better if it wasn't for the YMCA or for the Boy Scouts. Failing to acknowledge the corporate or the organization after the gift award is made. It's hard because sometimes these foundations seem sort of faceless, nameless automatons, but they're not just money dispensing machines. There are people behind them as well. So be sure that you're acknowledging them just like you would for an individual. Not providing financial or progress reports on time. You don't want to get blacklisted with an organization. And if their reporting guidelines are going to be too onerous for you, reconsider whether you should apply to them. Failure to know their priorities or limitations. So, for example, they give $5,000 grants and you're asking for $50,000. They only support water conservation and you're asking for money for smart girls. Organizations that want an exception to deadlines or funding guidelines. Don't ask, you won't get them, and it kind of upsets them. A belief that you're entitled to funding instead of that you're asking. Failure to disclose major facts or changes that bear on the proposal. Be absolutely upfront. And finally, boilerplate proposals, where it's obvious that you didn't adapt your proposal based on the needs and wants of this funder. Again, it's easy to go automated because it doesn't seem like you're applying to a person, but you really are. And they are philanthropists just the same as the individuals you talk to. They just have a different way of giving out money. If you're interested in learning a little more, I've got a couple pages of resources. You'll be able to download these when you download the other resources. A couple of books you can read. The Foundation Center Online, which has links to over 900 foundations websites. GuideStar, which is a really good resource. Fundraisinginfo.com. On bgca.net, you can find our measurements and statistics section, which will give you the kind of data that you need to beef up your proposal for your funders. There's a fantastic free e-learning course available on the Foundation Center. It's called Introduction to Finding Grants. I really recommend that you click on this and sign up. You can do it at your own pace, but it's a great way to take the learning one step further. There's the Boys and Girls of St. Louis Grants Task Calendar that I mentioned. A couple of different interesting articles, one called The Portal Problem, and the other is Key Facts on U.S. Foundations. There's also a PDF of this PowerPoint so that you can go through kind of the different steps and things that we've laid out here. And then lastly is a link to the fundraisingbank.org. As many of you know, this is our Resource Development Operation and Collaborative Services website. There are some boilerplate grant applications on there that you could take and then adapt to meet with your funders. There's some information about applying for grants, and there's also a calendar of some grants that you can apply for. At this point, I'd like to see if there are any questions. Just type them there in the question box, and we will do our best to get them answered. So far, no questions. I'm going to flip to my contact information. If you think of a question after you get on here, after you get off of here, rather, you can email me or call me to ask. I would love to help. Yes, so 2 questions. Where can you find the sample grant proposals? That's on fundraisingbank.org, fundraisingbank.org. You can find some sample grant proposals on there. Websites that list upcoming grant opportunities, we always list those on bgca.net. We also include them in the Fundraising Bank. So those are some great places to find upcoming fundraising opportunities. How do you deal with a donor who wants a line item budget? I would say, that's a good question. Give them as much information as you possibly can. If you can develop your budget as in-depth as possible, and then explain to them the reasons why you aren't able to adapt to their request. So what is it that keeps you from being able to put together that line item budget? So hopefully that's helpful. The next question, yes, I will be at the conference in Long Beach next week. Topher, thanks for giving me the opportunity to do a gratuitous plug. At the pre-conference for Long Beach in California and the Midwest Leadership Conference will have resource development pre-conferences. So those would be opportunities to learn a little bit more about being a data-driven organization. Michael wanted to know if you can tell us about past successes of clubs that went through this webinar. You know, Michael, I can't because this is the first year that we've done this sort of unified approach to webinars with one sort of person and department doing all of the webinars. So this one's actually brand new. So I wish that I could tell you lots of success stories, but hopefully next year you all can write back to me and tell me about your success stories so that I can share them on the webinar next year. How do you crack foundations that do not accept unsolicited proposals? Great question. The first thing that I would do is see if I could find anyone who's been funded by them before, find out how they were able to get in to that organization. I think that that would be one way to try to crack that foundation. It may be that someone on your board knows someone on the board of those foundations, and that person can help make an entree. It may also be that one of their financial advisors is one of your donors, or in some other way, there's a way to get to one person on that board. Otherwise, you can try, if you don't have anybody who can reach out and make that connection, you don't know anyone who's ever been funded by them, you can certainly try calling or writing to ask if you can build a relationship with that program officer. And just kind of be persistent. Of course, it's a balancing act. You don't want to spend too much time on an organization that's not going to fund you. Jeff is wondering if BGCA has ever considered grant writing support for organizations who don't have RD or grant writers on staff. I wish that we had enough people to be able to offer that kind of support. Right now, what we do have are some of those pre-written grant proposal forms, and we do have the NYOI data. Unfortunately, we don't have anyone who can do that grant writing support, but it is an excellent idea. You may be able to find someone in your area who can do that for a nominal fee, as you've suggested too, and write that into your administrative overhead. Peggy is asking, what's the best way to answer questions regarding cash or in-kind matches if you're applying for multiple agencies or foundations. So if they're wanting to know who else is supporting this project and what will the matches be, usually what you can do is let them know, make a grid that lists what proposals do you have in process, who are they to, and how much are you asking for. And that way they can see what the potential match is. It may be too that there are matches coming out of your own budget that you might not really think about. So for example, if your project is being run by your youth development professionals and you're asking for funding for, let's say, Power Hour, you're already committing some resources to that. You're committing some of your own staff time, you're committing space, you're committing paper, pens, different equipment, and so you may be able to leverage some of that as an organizational match, in addition to the in-kind or cash matches from other foundations. So you kind of just are honest and say, here's what we're trying to get so far. Let's see. Jessica is asking, if the donor wants to pick and choose what he will fund in the line item budget, but wants recognition for the full project, he's treating us like a vendor of his company and not as a nonprofit. That's really hard. So you can't really recognize him for the full project because he's not funding the full project, right? And I'm sure that that's exactly the problem that you're coming up against. I guess I would say trying to be creative in the way that you acknowledge that donor. Maybe he could be acknowledged as a group of, along with a group of other donors, or you could find the specific part that he is in fact funding. So he wants to pick and choose what he will fund, and he wants to not fund the whole thing. I think that you really have to be honest with that donor so that his expectations are reasonable. I think that's an excellent question. That's really hard to deal with, but you've got to just be sort of straight and narrow with that donor and be really honest with them about what's possible and what isn't possible. And if he's only funding one staff member and it takes 5 staff members, or if he only wants to fund the kids from one club and not the kids from another club, you certainly can let him do that, but the recognition should be appropriate. And although you may run the risk of upsetting him, you got to be honest with your donors. So Emily says, lots of foundations want to fund things. You're right, they do. Books, supplies, but our biggest needs are for general operating and salaries for staff. Any tips on how to write this so funders are interested and not turned off by supporting administrative costs? Emily, that's an awesome question. It's one that everyone on this webinar has probably faced at one point or another. I suggest that everybody read Dan Palotta, P-A-L-O-T-T-A, who makes really, really good arguments for why individuals are not overhead. So barring you having the time to read a book between now and when your next when your next application is due, think about your staff as how do they play a pivotal role in what you're trying to fund. So for example, if I'm trying to write that I need a meals program and my funder really only wants to pay for food, what I need to do is show how the cook is a vital part of making the food happen. The food can't be served, the food can't be prepared, the kids can't be educated on the health of the food if we don't have an individual who is carrying that out. So if you can really articulate that it's not just general overhead, it has an absolute and direct correlation to the impact that you are trying to prove and that you're trying to support in this application, I think that that's the way to get around that overhead problem. It's a good question, and knowing that all of your donors have it in their mind, you should start with it on top of mind like Emily is here so that you can get that money. Outside of BGCA, do you recommend any other sources for training? Sure, Michael, good question. One thing I would recommend is subscribing to as many different fundraising blogs as you can. Everything from Gail Perry to Movie Mondays. These will send you into your inbox various articles, infographics, resources and tools, and oftentimes they will connect you to other webinars. We're going to have coming up next year the Spillett Leadership University, and that will have a School of Resource Development that will offer lots of good trainings for you outside that is part of BGCA, but builds beyond just webinars and things like that. Michael, if you do some searches to see, I'm not sure what your budget is and so forth, there's a new organization that's putting on what's called Philanthropy University. That's free training. And so that would be a great source for you as well. So that's called Philanthropy University. But I recommend subscribing to everything that you can, and then you can always start deleting when you see stuff isn't helpful. Misty's asking the name of the Dan Pallotta book. Would you remember? Would you believe I can't remember the name of it? He spoke at the national conference a few years ago, and it was really fantastic. But you will find it if you do a search, because he's quite a phenomenon in the nonprofit sector. Okay, so at this point, if you go over to the Handouts tab and click to maximize it, you'll find those articles and resources that we talked about. You've got my contact information here. Please do reach out if there's anything that I can do to help. It would absolutely be my pleasure. And with that, we are adjourned. I want to thank you all so much for being here, and continue to join us for the rest of these webinars. I hope you'll find them helpful. Thank you so much and have a great afternoon.